Hello, everyone, and welcome to Virginia International University's MBA 636 Managerial Accounting course. Today, we're going to be talking about activity-based costing, which again refers to this process of the allocation of overhead costs to cost objectives. And we're going to talk about how we approach that using an activity-based costing approach. We'll talk about lean operations, and we'll talk about the cost of quality to an organization. So first, let's talk about the development and use of departmental overhead rates to allocate indirect costs. So we see that first we have to ask a question about, why and how do companies refine their cost allocation systems? So why do they refine them? One is that it may be that our current cost allocation system results in a mismatching of resources. That is, if we use something like, think about it in terms of a plant-wide allocation rate, where we just say all of our plant overhead costs are X number of dollars, and the total units of production out of our plant are X number of dollars, or Y number of units, and so we come up to this Z allocation rate per Y number of units. But what if some of those products don't use certain processes or certain departments in the plant? Well, if they don't use them, we've essentially allocated a cost to them where no benefit has been received. And if we have a multi-product plant, perhaps we're distorting or mismatching, or through this mismatching of resources, we're distorting what our true production cost is, which may impact our pricing decision. And as a result of this, we end up with, or may end up with, this idea of cost distortion, where we have over or under costed jobs. Then we talk about, well, who can refine their costs? Well, a manufacturing company can refine their costs. Service companies can refine cost allocation systems, as well as governmental agencies. So, the idea of this refinement of allocation methodologies being something unique only to manufacturing operations is not particularly accurate. And of course, all of this depends upon the particular cost structure of the organization, but the opportunity is generally there for any type of organization to refine their cost allocation system. And so if you recall from our earlier example where we used just one plant-wide overhead rate, and this example comes from our textbook, what we're doing is coming up with or calculating this predetermined manufacturing overhead rate, which we talked about earlier as being just their total estimated manufacturing overhead cost. So that's for the whole plant divided by the total estimated amount of the allocation base. And we said that allocation base could be direct labor hours, it could be units of production. I mean, it's up to us to determine what the allocation base is, but we should always be looking for some causal relationship between the allocation base and the costs that are spread across it. And in our example earlier, we had $1 million worth of manufacturing overhead divided by 62,500 total direct labor hours gave us a $16 per hour or per direct labor hour manufacturing overhead rate. Right? $1 million divided by 62,500 direct labor hours got us to $16 per direct labor hour predetermined manufacturing overhead rate based on the application of a plant-wide overhead rate. Okay? And so we look at using one predetermined manufacturing overhead rate to allocate manufacturing overhead to all units. Let's look at, in our book, we use the example of some exercise equipment. So let's look at an elliptical machine. So this elliptical machine, if we're using $16 per direct labor hours, we were told it uses 10 direct labor hours for manufacturing. So we allocated $160 of plant-wide manufacturing overhead to it. Then let's look at a treadmill. And so for the treadmill, using the same $16 per labor hour and the same 10 direct labor hours per treadmill, we got $160 allocated to that as well, right? And so that makes perfect sense, right? Based on simply allocating plant-wide manufacturing overhead to product using the direct labor hours as a base for that. One rate across one allocation base applied to the number of units of allocation base used by each product. So that's one way of doing this, okay? So now let's look to using plant or departmental overhead rates, where we separate our manufacturing overhead rates for each department and we allocate them to each product to the extent that each product uses the different manufacturing department. And so in this process we have 4 steps that we use. The first step is to estimate the departmental cost, right? The second step would be to estimate the departmental allocation base. Then to calculate the rates using the input from steps 1 and 2, and then to allocate some manufacturing overhead for each department to end jobs that use those departments, right? This in turn results in less distortion. And if you think about those steps that we just talked about, right, there's absolutely no difference between those steps at the departmental level than we had those steps at the plant-wide level. It's simply that by taking them down to the departmental level, we're able to attach cost of specific departments that use the departmental processes in the manufacturing process, right? And don't confuse this with job cost versus process costing, please. Similar words to talk about them, but different concepts. But all we're doing is saying, well, now I want to come up with separate departmental manufacturing overhead rates to apply. They're still predetermined, but they're at the departmental level and they get applied based on a product's usage of that departmental function versus rolling all those departments up at some plant-wide level and developing a rate. And so in this example, we have manufacturing overhead or manufacturing plant with $1 million of total estimated manufacturing overhead and 2 departments, right? We have a machining department and we have an assembly department. So we have the same $1 million we talked about in the previous example, but now we've identified it by whether it's in machining or whether it's in assembly. And machining has $400,000 worth of manufacturing overhead. Assembly has $600,000 worth of manufacturing overhead. And we then divide each of those manufacturing overhead total costs by a departmental allocation base, which yields the manufacturing overhead rate for that department only. So if we had and we'll talk about this a little later, but if we had a product that didn't go through machining at all, it would get no machining manufacturing overhead. And right, that makes good sense. And so when we liken that back to our previous discussion where we said that we want to eliminate the mismatching of resources so that we can reduce cost distortions, I think we can see how this approach achieves that objective. So now we want to talk about, well, when do we use departmental overhead rates? And that's best used when departments incur different amounts and types of manufacturing overhead, right? And then secondly, it's best used where different departments or products, different jobs or products use the departmental resources to a different extent. And so again, it just makes for a more accurate matching of the cost of a product with the product or the manufacturer of that product. And so in this example, what we're given, we are back to our machining and assembly. We know we had $400,000 worth of total manufacturing overhead costs for the machining department and $600,000 for the assembly department, or we have our $1 million worth of plant-wide manufacturing overhead. But the allocation base for machining is now 12,500 hours, and the allocation base for assembly is 50,000. And so the total of those two is the 62,500 plant-wide hours delivered, if you recall. But you can see that they're broken down separately between departments now, and so we're able to become more granular about the manufacturing overhead that's applied. And so in this example, how would you think about it for a minute? How would you get to a departmental overhead rate given these two items, the manufacturing cost for the department and the departmental labor hours? If you think back to our 4 steps, steps 1 and is to determine the manufacturing overhead cost. So we've done that for each department. And step 2 is to determine the allocation base. And we've done that for each department. And then step 3 is to really calculate the overhead rate, which is what we're looking at doing here. And if you recall, all that is the cost divided by the total cost divided by the allocation base. So, and this is all an example you can follow through after the lecture if you want on pages 182 to 187 of the text. And so following on with that, we see that we have a $32 direct labor hour manufacturing overhead allocation per direct labor hour from the machining department, and a $12 per direct labor hour manufacturing overhead allocation as a result of the assembly department, right? But you can see now that's different, right? That's very different from the $16 per hour predetermined plant-wide manufacturing overhead rate that we calculated earlier. And then the question is, well, how do we attach these to product, right? So what's this tell me? How do we attach these to products? And coincidentally, that's what this slide does. So for our machining department, we're going to attach 30, and this is for elliptical machines. It's up in the header there, and it's Exhibit 4-8 on page 186, and it deals with elliptical machines. So now we're allocating manufacturing overhead to elliptical machines, and we're going to allocate that based on the number of machining hours an elliptical machine uses and the number of assembly hours. In this case, we see that ellipticals use 1 direct labor hour of machining, which would get it $32 of cost, and assembly, the elliptical uses 9 hours of direct labor hours to assemble an elliptical machine. And so it's going to be costed with $12 per direct labor hour. And so this gets us to $140 of total manufacturing overhead allocated to the ellipticals based on the amount of machining department direct labor hours it uses and assembly department direct labor hours it uses. So we've allocated, now this is just manufacturing overhead at the departmental level. It doesn't take into account our raw material costs like our direct labor and direct materials. So we can go through the same example that's on page 186, Exhibit 4-9, where we talk about the treadmills, right? So remember, our plant produces elliptical machines and treadmills. So the treadmills use 4 direct labor hours of machining and 6 direct labor hours of assembly, using our same allocation rate from each department of $32 and $12 in machining and assembly respectively, applied at the amount of resource that the treadmill uses from each of these departments. We'll get a different total manufacturing overhead allocation. And so here we allocate $128 from machinery, and we allocate $72 from assembly to get $200 worth of total manufacturing overhead allocated. And so now we can just do a comparison between the methodology where we used a plant-wide or predetermined plant-wide overhead rate for manufacturing overhead allocation, which ended up being $160 per machine, versus allocating based on departmental overhead manufacturing overhead rates of $140 to ellipticals and $200 to treadmills. And we can see that the cost distortion between the two methodologies was we were overcosting our elliptical machines by $20 and we were undercosting our treadmill machines by $40. And again, I think you can see very clearly if we were using the prior costing allocation methodology, and determining what our costs could be what our sales price would be for each of these machines based on a cost build-up approach. And we all know there are different ways to determine what our what our price will be. But if we were using cost as a strong determinant of that, we may have been making some very different and incorrect pricing decisions, or at least maybe inaccurate pricing decisions versus switching to this departmental manufacturing overhead rate allocation methodology, where we have enhanced or refined our look at how costs hit our products. So there's a lot of value to this. Of course, along with this comes a higher cost too, right? Because now instead of tracking my cost at the plant-wide level, I have to track them at a departmental level. But like everything we do, it becomes a function of the cost-benefit trade-off associated with the decision to move from plant-wide to departmental allocation. So I hope all that's clear. These are all very good and clear. Not very complicated examples of this, but if it's not clear as you read back through the text, please don't hesitate to email or call me. So now we want to talk about this idea of using activity-based costing to allocate indirect costs. I think you have a good example. We walked through a couple of different methodologies of this discussion about what is a direct versus an indirect cost, and then what are my the processes for how I allocate my indirect costs to my cost objectives. And one of these methodologies is this activity-based costing approach that we're going to talk about. So activity-based costing really, it achieves the same purpose, right? We're allocating indirect costs to productions. It's generally thought of as a more refined system of reducing cost distortion, right? And that's ultimately what we would like to get to, right? A fair and equitable look at what our products cost us to manufacture. And we don't want that distorted by a bunch of allocation methodologies. There are plenty of other more complicated reasons why we might have to live with that distortion, but this offers us some options for overhead allocation methodologies. And so it also focuses on the activities and cost of the activities. And these cost of activities in the activity-based costing world are referred to as, cost drivers drive the cost of these activities. And by going through the activity-based costing exercises, it really helps management get an understanding of what their cost drivers are. And what we end up with at the end of the day is a separate allocation rate for each activity. In our previous examples, we got separate allocation rates for departmental activities, for departmental functional processes, right? So it was machining or assembly. In ABC costing, we look at activities versus a particular department and try to determine, well, what are the costs of those activities? And then how do we allocate out indirect costs based on these activities, right? Thus, activity-based costing, right? And so some manufacturing activities, for example, we're given here are things like machine setup, materials handling, fabricating parts, supervising assemblies, inspecting products, or packaging products. And so some of these may be unique to certain departments. Others may be unique to certain functional roles, right? And so you can't really look at them as in the same context as you do departmental activities and departmental overhead rates, because they don't necessarily follow that same pattern. The cost drivers of them are not necessarily unique to a specific department. They should be unique to a particular activity, which may span multiple departments. And so this just gives us, we walk through some of the steps, and what this tells us is if we look at the step one, is to identify and estimate indirect costs. Okay, so that's the same as step one before that we talked about with respect to plant-wide or departmental overhead. But here, what we're doing is identifying and estimating the indirect costs of particular activities. For example, machine setup, material handling, fabricating, supervising, inspecting, and packaging, right? And so we talk about, well, what is the activity that, are the activities that are incurred, the cost of these activities, and meeting the activity objective. And so, for example, materials handling, right, we have costs associated with forklifts, fuel to run the forklift, and the operator's wages. For fabricating parts, we have costs such as machine lease payments, electricity, repairs, and maintenance, right? For supervising assembly, we have the production engineer's labor. and so on and so forth. But these are the cost drivers of that activity, and some of the benefit of this process or this approach is that it really forces management to understand what the cost drivers are of the activity, so that if we need to minimize the cost of the activity for whatever reason, we understand what those drivers are that we need to have an impact on. And then over in the right-hand column, we see what the total cost for that total activity cost pool. So $80,000 is the total cost associated with the machine setup. $200,000 is the total cost associated with materials handling. And we go on down each of the activities to see what the total cost is for that activity, and we get down to the $1 million. We should remember this is the $1 million, right, that we have plant-wide operating and departmental manufacturing overhead. So we've got $1 million again here in total activity based costing, broken out by the activity associated with that we've been able to identify. And so then the second thing that we need to do, step 2, is select our allocation base for each activity. Same step 2 we've done for all the other examples we talked about. So in machine setup, we have the number of setups. In the materials handling, we have the number of parts. In the fabricating, we use machine hours. In supervising assembly, we use direct labor hours. So each of these activities, right, has some allocation base attached to it. And as I've said before, it's critical to remember that this allocation base should have some causal relationship to the activity. That is, the base, right, should have some sort of causal relationship, right, to the activity. And so we've already talked about how we got, step 1 was to identify the total cost for each of the activities. And so step 2, and we see in the far right-hand column, is the total estimated amount of the allocation base. You see we have estimated 8,000 setups then. We have estimated 400,000 parts that are going to be number of parts moved. We have 12,500 machine hours, right, for fabricating parts activity. We have 150 direct labor hours associated with the supervising of assembly. And we have $170,000 associated with inspections, right, the number of inspections, and then we have cubic feet, which $100,000 associated with cubic feet activity or packaging, and with the allocation base being the cubic feet packaged. So now we've got what our allocation base is. And so in step 3 here, all we're doing is computing the cost allocation rate for each of these allocation activities. And if we look at our machine setup, we see we estimated $80,000 was going to cost us to run the machine setup activity for that year, and we were going to have 8,000 machine setups. So 80,000 divided by 8,000 is $10 per machine setup. For materials handling, we estimated that we would have the $200,000 cost associated with materials handling activity, and we would allocate that out based on the number of parts moved, which we estimated to be $400,000, so we would allocate 50 cents per part. And we go on and on down the list till we get down to packaging, where we said, well, we have $100,000 worth of cost associated with the packaging activity, which we allocated out based on cubic feet packaged. We estimated we would package 400,000 cubic feet, so the $100,000 divided by the 400,000 cubic feet packaged gets us to 25 cents per cubic foot that we will allocate out to the product. And so again, this is step 3. I mean, it's just, it's similar to step 3, whether it's the plant-wide or departmental. It's just we're doing it based on activities, and we're coming up with different allocation rates per activity as a result of the drivers of those costs. So now, what happens, now that we've got all of these allocation rates, what happens when we apply these activities to our elliptical machines or to our treadmill machines? What happens to the manufacturing overhead cost if it's applied under this methodology to those machines? And so here, if we've got the activity, and we're talking about elliptical machines in the header there, info for elliptical. We've got the activity cost allocation rate that we just calculated. Now we need to know what is the actual usage of this activity on this product. And so to manufacture an elliptical machine, we have two separate setups. So at $10 per setup, we allocate $20 of manufacturing overhead to the elliptical machines for machine setup. For materials handling, we use 20 parts in the machine, so at 50 cents per part, we allocate $10. And we can go down our list of activities, applying the allocation rate per that activity to the units of the allocation base that are incurred in the manufacture of the elliptical machine in order to get to $109 of manufacturing overhead allocated to one elliptical machine. So, and so under this scenario, we came up with one rate that was applied based on $16 on plant-wide manufacturing overhead rate under that methodology, right? When we looked at the departmental overhead rate on elliptical machines, we came out with a cost of $140 worth of manufacturing overhead applied, and then under this methodology, we come up with $109 worth of manufacturing overhead applied. So again, granularity and refining, right? So and we need to, but you can imagine, right? So all of this activity-based costing information takes time and effort and money, and so the question becomes at the end of the day, is it worth, is there a cost-benefit trade-off to managing this type of activity-based costing system? So let's look at this now for treadmills, right? Because we should expect to come up with a different answer there too for what's allocated for manufacturing overhead. So this gives us a look at this for treadmills, right? And so we go through the same process that we did for the ellipticals. And at the end of the day, what we end up with then based on treadmill manufacturing process is that $212 is allocated for manufacturing overhead to the treadmill versus the $109 that was allocated to the elliptical machines. And so again, it gets very important for us to look at, what is it that drives the cost of a particular activity? That is these cost drivers. So here are just some examples. So if we're talking about material purchasing, right? Cost drivers might be something like the number of purchase orders that are issued. If we're talking about quality inspections, cost drivers could be the number of inspections, but so this is a cost driver. We have to accumulate all of the costs associated with quality inspections, right? So that may be people's time. That may be, generally it's going to be, very intensive labor, and maybe fringes on that labor, and some of the other costs that you can envision with with respect to particular calibration equipment. That's also quality inspection. All of these costs go into a pool of costs that are associated with quality inspections, and then we estimate the number of inspections that we want to get out of the time period that that pool of costs covers, and that pool of costs then divided by the number of inspection gives us the per inspection cost that's applied to a product based on the number of inspections required to ensure the quality of that product, and so on and so forth for each of these different examples of activities. And so obviously we have some benefits and limitations of our activity-based costing, activity-based management systems, right? So we use activity-based costing information to help us make decisions, and those decisions are with respect to the pricing and product mix, right? So, based on how I allocate my manufacturing overhead and what my pricing decision is, or what my target profit is, it may drive my pricing decision. Obviously, if I'm able to manufacture higher profit products, I'm going to, and sell them, right, then I'm going to manufacture as many high profit products I can sell and manufacture fewer low profit products, all other things being equal. And so that's this idea of pricing and product mix. using ABC and getting the cost drivers to our different activities really helps me understand what's driving my cost. So if I need to minimize cost, it really kind of helps me to identify at a very granular level what my costs are and where I might have the opportunity to save some money. And then finally, all of this, of course, goes hand in hand with management. And what is management but planning and control? So our role as managerial accountants is to provide management with this type of information to enhance the effectiveness of their decision making. So we talked for a second about pricing and product mix decisions. We may decide based on the allocation methodology we choose for manufacturing overhead to change the prices for products after we identify these different total costs. We may decide to market the higher profitability product, push that product more than the lower profitability product. Or we may shift the product mix away from less profitable lines. So, ABC tends to increase the unit cost of low volume products and decrease the unit cost of high volume products. And so, again, with this, we may end up changing what our product mix is that we're offering for sale. And so then when we talk about cutting costs, right, we want to be able to analyze the cost in the value chain. And we have both value-added activities and non-value activities in our value chain. And so what we want to do is to understand what are the cost drivers to each of these value activities versus non-value activities, so that we can minimize the cost of the non-value-added activities, right? And so when we talk about value-added activities, you're really talking about activities that the customer is willing to pay for. They provide some value to the end product or services that are aimed at satisfying customers' expectations, right? And so, we don't want to cut those, right, to the extent we don't have to, because then we're meeting or not meeting our customers' expectations. If we talk about non-value-added activities, which we refer to as waste activities, these costs neither enhance the customer's image of the product, or they neither enhance the customer's image of the product, nor do they produce us a competitive advantage. And examples of these might be costs such as storage of inventory, movement of inventory from one place in the factory to another, right? So we could theoretically reduce those costs, and the customer, that would be transparent to the customer, right? How we move our product around our manufacturing facility should not have an impact on the product the customer receives, right? How we store our inventory should not have any impact on the value or on our customers' expectations. So these are just different perspectives on how we can use ABC costing to enhance cost-cutting decisions. And then we have planning and control. And so, and a lot of what we do as managerial accountants is to provide input to the planning and control decisions by using these cost of activities to create budgets. We create these predetermined activity-based overhead rates, right, that are applied to products throughout the production process through the year. And then we are able to also compare with the actual activities to see if our goals are met. Because early on, as we talked, the first and second steps are estimating, right? Estimating the cost and then estimating the allocation base. At some point in time, we have to go back and compare those estimates with what the actual was. And so we have a strong role with respect to providing inputs to the planning and control decisions. And so we're still able to use this ABC methodology outside of the manufacturing role. And so we talk, we could be, if we're not a manufacturer, we could be a merchandiser, that's a retailer, or a service provider. If we're either one of those, we can still use ABC to help us find the most profitable product or service, right? It's still a way of refining our cost for the allocation of indirect costs to a cost objective. It just happens to be a retail product or a service offering, not a manufacturing process. And then we see that when we talk about manufacturers, manufacturers allocate costs to production activities, right? Versus merchandising and service companies who allocate overhead costs to operating activities. So, but the theory, the methodology, and approach remains the same. And then we can talk a little bit about sustainability and refined costing systems. Manufacturers, merchandisers, or service providers want to understand what the environmental impact of their operations are. And so we can also look at this idea of environmental overhead, and we can allocate that to the different activities that drive that environmental overhead cost. And the goal of this is that it creates better transparency so that we have decision making that can be reflective of more sustainability, right? We're not just making decisions today based on what a department's overhead cost for that day is. We're, again, breaking down our cost into activities so that we can better manage those activities, better understand their cost drivers, and through that process create better transparency. And so we talked a couple of times about this idea of cost-benefit test, and when we're talking about that, what are we talking about? I hope you all said that do the benefits of adopting the activity-based costing or activity-based management exceed the cost? And so when are these benefits higher? So they're higher for companies in competitive markets because accurate product cost information is essential, right? And activity-based management can pinpoint cost savings and opportunities. And they are higher for, activity-based costing is more beneficial when there's a higher risk of cost distortion. And we say, why is that? And it's because where we have many different products, we use many different types of and amounts of resources, and activity-based costing allows us to be more granular in how we apply cost associated with those types and amounts of resources. It's more beneficial where we have high indirect costs, right? Because let's face it, we have low indirect costs where it may not pass the cost-benefit test. So why do I want to spend a lot of time and effort and money establishing and maintaining this indirect cost allocation process when I really, it really concerns low indirect cost? And then it's also more beneficial when I have high and low volume products so that I'm able to really attach the right cost to my high and low volume products to help define, again, my pricing and product mix decisions. And so next we want to talk about the cost of adopting ABC. So these costs are generally lower when we have an accounting information system that provides us with the expertise to develop these costs, right? If we can collect and accumulate these costs in our system as a normal byproduct of processing the cost for payment and accumulating the cost and manufacturing activity, then that's going to drive down the cost of the system, which ties back to the idea of information technology and having access to things like barcoding and optical scanning and some of the other enhancements that, again, help us to more efficiently gather the cost and more efficiently gather the allocation base so that the calculation and application steps 3 and 4 are lower effort steps. And then we say, well, what's been the experience of companies with this? Are they glad they adopted it? And just based on studies that have been done, 89% of the companies that adopted it said it was worth the cost. But it's caveated with that it's not a cure-all. It helps managers understand costs better. But as we've talked before, and you talk in many classes, I'm sure, at the end of the day, it's the manager's decisions. It's senior management in the organization's decision. If this process helps them to better understand that and improve their decision making, that's good. But that shouldn't be considered a given as a result of adopting ABC. And then And then finally, we want to talk about the signs here under this objective of that the old system may be distorting costs. So when might we think about revisiting what our overhead allocation methodology is? So our cost system may need repair when either managers don't understand costs or profits, bids are lost when we expected to win them. Right? We're not. We don't think we're going in. We think we're going in at a very competitive price, but yet we end up losing the bid because our competitors bid a much lower price. Well, that may tell us that we don't know what our costs are with respect to that particular product very well. We may win bids when we expect to lose. And so again, maybe we're going in with an unrealistically low price and we didn't really expect to win the bid, but for whatever reason we decided to propose on it anyway and we ended up winning. That might not be, as good a thing as we think, right? If our costs really are significantly different than what we propose them at. And then when competitors price similar projects much higher or lower, right, that tells us that maybe, they could be wrong, but maybe our allocation methodology and how we cost their products needs to be revisited. And then also our system may be outdated if there's a diversified product line. And just over time, companies may, so we'll add another product because it's peripheral and we think it's a good idea. And we'll add another product because it's peripheral and we think it's a good idea. And we'll add another, just we continue to add on products, but we use the same costing methodology that we used from day one without revisiting whether or not that costing methodology should change as a result of this product mix. And so these are just some signals about when we may want to consider whether or not a methodology we use now or today to allocate indirect costs in general are creating distorted costs, causing us some of these signals that we talked about earlier on in this slide. So now we want to talk about this idea of lean operations. So under traditional production systems, and I'm sure you all probably covered this under some logistics classes that you may have taken, but under traditional production systems, we have kept large inventories on hand, right? And that creates some problems for us. And these problems include things like storage costs, right? We have inventories use cash, so storage costs drive up our working capital requirements. Those working capital requirements result in interest expense and other financial costs. We may be hiding quality problems, right, by keeping large inventories on hand. Maybe there's a problem in our production process, but because that problem is latent and it's inherent in our inventory, and because we have large inventories on hand, it's not getting out to the consumer in time. And while we wouldn't want the consumer to be the one who finds the quality product, if that's how it's found and we've produced a 6-month supply of that, and we've got all of that on hand, we could have a very large high-cost problem on our hands, right? And then because we have large inventories, we really cover up this idea of bottlenecks, right? Because we, if our production process has a bottleneck in it, we don't really, but yet it doesn't impact our ability to provide our product to the customer in a timely, at the right time, because we have these high inventories on hand. Then we never have the opportunity to visit and try to solve that bottleneck. And we may have obsolete products also sitting in this high level of inventory that we don't know about that could affect us financially. So how do we solve for all this? Well, we do that by initiating these lean production systems. So lean production, right, lean thinking is really a philosophy and business strategy, and it's really, a way of thinking about how we manufacture what we manufacture without any waste. So we talk about it being a philosophy and business strategy. It should permeate all of our decisions. I mean, in truly lean organizations, every process, every step along how we provide our service or build our product is done with lean thinking in mind so that we minimize or eliminate waste. The primary goal is to eliminate waste and cost, and then the focus of just in time, and that's this idea of lean thinking, is to purchase raw materials just in time for production and to finished goods just in time for delivery, right? We have very little inventory along the entire process anywhere. And so what are some of the common characteristics of just-in-time where the goal is continuous production? So production occurs in self-contained cells. We have broad employee roles. That is where the employee, instead of simply assembling something, their role being something to simply assemble something, maybe they conduct maintenance on the equipment, maybe they perform setups, they inspect their own work, maybe they operate other machines, right? So we have broad employee roles. So we have, again, the goal is very little employee downtime, right? We produce batches in small amounts, right? Not large batches. And we call this a demand pool system so that, we produce this batch based on what the next production step requires in order to complete that step. Or we produce our product in total based on how the market, how much demand is there in the market for a product. We don't build up inventories on some projected demand and let that sit there and get pulled down. We are really talking about this idea of demand pull. It could be demand in the manufacturing process, it could be demand in the delivery process, or in the sales process to the customer. We shorten setup times, and a part of that is having these broad employee roles. We shorten manufacturing times. We have a large emphasis on quality, and we deal a lot with supply chain management, right? And so, for us to have a just-in-time inventory system, it means we buy our raw materials just in time, right? That's part of lean manufacturing, lean production. Well, that means we have to have very dependable suppliers who we can count on, and we have to have backups to those suppliers that we can count on, so that, because we don't maintain a large inventory of raw materials, we don't run into raw material shortages, which just then manifests itself through the rest of the manufacturing line. And I'm sure that, through some logistics courses, you talk about this supply chain management, and this becomes increasingly complex in today's world where we have global supply chain management efforts in place. So, think about lean production and what it takes if you have a local manufacturing process versus a manufacturing process that depends on raw material inputs from the other side of the world. And so there are some drawbacks to the lean production system because we have no inventory buffers, right? That's one of the main goals of this just-in-time lean production. We have no inventory buffers. So we become vulnerable when projects strike suppliers or distributors. And some examples of this include, delays in delivery may impact us because we don't have inventory buffers. Personnel problems like union strikes may impact us because we don't have finished goods sitting there in inventory because we're demand pool based, right? Union strikes or personnel problems could impact us. Just shortage of parts due to recalled products or weather-related issues, right? So these are all items or examples of concerns we have to deal with in implementing a just-in-time or lean production system. And there are many more. These are just some examples. And so as usual, we want to think about, what's sustainability? What's the connection or the nexus between sustainability and lean thinking? And that is that both seek to reduce waste, right? Sustainability and lean thinking both try to reduce waste. Lean focuses internal, green focuses external, right? So if we're lean thinking, we're thinking about, what's the impact on cost and resources to our internal processes. If we're thinking sustainability, right, we're generally thinking external, right? What's it mean for the people who work for us? It's just a mix of internal and external. What's it mean for the community we live in, right? What's it mean globally on the worldwide environment, right? And so, the idea of sustainability and lean thinking are, very closely connected, and a lot of people talk about it in terms of this lean and green nexus. And so our final topic for this presentation is just talk about this the use of quality, because we talk about cost, and we want to minimize cost, and we want to be as profitable as we can. We want to support the environment. We want to support our workers. We want to do all of this, but we also have, we want to do all of this in a high quality way so that our products, again, meet our customers' expectations. And so what's total quality management, right? So if we talk about lean production, we have no inventory. So we have any defective processes can slow down or shut down our process, right? So with quality management, our goal is to provide customers, obviously, with superior products and services. We do this through a continuous improvement process, which requires more investment upfront to generate savings in the back end of the value chain. And when we talk about that, what we're talking about is we want to inspect our product for quality deficiencies or defects early in the process so that we can adjust the process to eliminate them, so that we don't find those defects later in the process that result in a lot of rework costs, and because we don't have a lot of inventory as a result of lean production, then running out of product, right? So we invest more upfront in the quality process and quality inspection process in order to identify these problems. So we have 4 types of quality costs. They are prevention costs, appraisal costs, internal failure costs, and external failure costs. And we'll just talk a couple of minutes on each one of these. So prevention costs are aimed at avoiding poor quality goods or services, right? So what do we do in order to prevent poor quality goods or services? Examples include employee training, improved materials, preventative maintenance, right? So we train our employees on quality and how important it is, and how important it is that they do their, they perform their roles at a high quality level, because, employee morale and employee engagement really drive a lot of quality issues in an organization. So we should spend some time and effort helping our employees understand their roles with respect to that, as well as rewarding them for supporting that role. So maybe we buy a little bit higher quality materials, right? If that's what that's what our inspection suggests is necessary in order to avoid a downstream quality defect. And preventative maintenance, so maybe we go in and calibrate our machines more often, right, so that we can keep to adhere to lower tolerances with respect to machine deficiencies. Then we talk about appraisal costs, which detect poor quality. So these are, detection costs, right? And examples of these include inspection throughout the production process, inspection of the final product, and product testing, right? The goal of each of these processes is to detect poor quality goods or services. And the important point here, too, is before they go to the customer, right? That's the worst of all worlds. So is that our customer finds our defect and tells us about it. So the third type of quality costs are internal failure costs. So we want to avoid poor quality cost or service before delivery to customers, right? So we want to identify those internally. And examples of that is that a production loss caused by downtime or rejected product units. And then finally, we have external failure costs, and those are those costs that are incurred after the defective product is delivered. And examples of those are lost profits from lost customers who just don't buy from us again, or warranty costs because we have to rework their product, or service costs at customer sites. So we have to send someone out to where a customer is in order to provide warranty work, or sales returns due to quality products. And so, we can see how I think each of these types of quality costs, we think about quality efforts in terms of these 4 buckets. I think it helps us to understand where we might be able to leverage and where it might make sense in whatever manufacturing or service offering process we engage in. Where does it make sense to incorporate these different types of quality costs? And then we talk about non-manufacturing costs of quality. So again, we talk about, we've been talking about a lot of times we tend to focus on manufacturing firms, but we always want to remember we've got retailers and merchandisers, and we've got service firms. And both of these other types of organizations, service or merchandising companies, also incur costs of quality We have prevention costs there, which has professional training of staff and then developing standardized service checklists, right? So that, again, these are efforts that can be put in place to prevent quality issues in service firms and retail companies. And then we have appraisal costs, which could include the cost associated with the review of work continuously and then inspection of work before releasing. And I can tell you, I work for a service organization, and all good service firms incur these prevention and appraisal costs, and they incur, other costs in the process of offering their service aimed at minimizing the impact of any poor quality that a customer may perceive as a result of engaging in that firm. And so one way of monitoring these costs is to have a quality cost report, right? And there are some things that a quality cost report would tell us. And so it would identify, categorize, and quantify the costs before that are incurred relating to quality. So we know how much are we paying for, the prevention, the appraisal, for the internal, and then for the external failure costs, right? Then we calculate the percentage of total quality costs that are incurred in each category, right? And then we use that methodology, that report, the outcome of all of that as a framework for decision. And generally what we see is that we can increase prevention costs and appraisal costs, and it reduces our cost of quality issues, such as the internal failure cost and the external failure cost. And that makes sense, doesn't it, right? So if I spend more money in my prevention activities and my appraisal activities, then through the process, as a product moves through my process, my internal failure costs should be reduced and my external failure costs should be reduced. And so that ends chapter 4. It was kind of a long chapter, but it was an important chapter, and I think it helped to kind of summarize this idea of manufacturing overhead. It gave some good examples of how we refine that. Why would we want to refine that? What are the benefits of it? How can we do that with respect to activity based costing? We talked about quality cost, right? And or the cost of quality and the importance of that. We talked about this idea of lean thinking and lean manufacturing and sort of eliminating waste from our process, whether we're offering a product or a service. And so please go back and read the chapter. Make sure you're comfortable with it, and don't hesitate to contact me if anything is unclear or you have any questions on it at all. And thanks very much for your time.